but what differs from probably the golfers is looking a bit more specific at the demands of the sport, really. So looking at specifically the rotation, the strength in certain areas, like through the pelvis, through the glutes, their ability to rotate in certain areas and load, how they load in certain patterns. Because if they don't load in those sort of patterns, they're going to go what we tend to say is like off plane. Think about a plane of how a club or a racket or a bat or whatever it goes on. The more sort of problems we have in the body, the less likely we are to stay on plane and change the position of the club.
Welcome to the In an Athlete podcast. I'm your host, Trent, and this is the show where we dive into all things youth athlete development, strength and conditioning, and the mindset needed to thrive on and off the field. Whether you're a parent looking to support your child's athletic journey, a coach seeking fresh insights, or an athlete ready to take your game to the next level, you're in the right place. Before we jump in, make sure to hit that subscribe button to stay updated on our latest episodes. If you enjoy the show, please give us a like, share it with your friends, and help us reach even more people who can benefit from these insights. Together, we can empower the next generation of athletes to perform at their best. Now, let's get into it. Welcome back to the In Athlete podcast. I've got another special guest here with me. I've got Mr. Shane Campbell. First of all, Shane is an osteopath who's had experience on the LPGA Tour, and he's currently running a practice in Dingley Village called the Dingley Health Hub. He's recently opened up, and he's actually, doing really well in the area, servicing the Dingley and surrounding areas. But today we're going to be talking more about the golf side. But before we get into that, Shane, first of all, welcome, and tell us a little bit about yourself.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Obviously, it was a pleasure when you asked me to come on the podcast. So it's really enjoyed coming and have a chat and talk through some of the stuff in terms of pro athletes and golfing specifically. But yeah, so my history is an osteopath, trained in Melbourne at Vic Uni. And then I, after working a little bit in Melbourne, went out, worked on the Pro Women's Golf Tour on the LPGA Tour. Worked out there for about sort of 6 years roughly. This is all sort of pre-COVID. Worked with sort of a large group of the top female golfers in the world. Worked with a few of the men's and with a couple of tennis players, which kind of has been a crossover in terms of the tours and sort of similar sports and sort of requirements, obviously. Now I'm back in Melbourne. Opened up a clinic in Dingley, as you mentioned, Dingley Health Hub, which is good. So I was working with sort of general population, but obviously with my background, working with a lot of athletes, both sort of golf specific and also AFL, soccer, anything, tennis, all those sort of common Australian sports as well.
Cool. And then I guess we want to focus more on the golfing side because it seems like golf is really, from my perspective, I'm working with quite a few golfers at the moment. It's kind of like seeing a bit of a boom, but also at the junior level as well. So we'll go down that side, but also in terms of golf around the world, there's a lot more investment at the college side. A lot of kids in Australia actually want to go play college golf. Just seeing golf as a sport really explode, especially at the junior levels, where I would personally consider it as like an old man's game, but for whatever reason, I think it was Bryson DeChambeau really brought and Tiger Woods, they're kind of like the pioneers and brought a new set of eyes to the game, and it's kind of changed for the better in that sense.
Yeah, I think definitely. Well, Tiger is obviously the linchpin of everything in golf, right? As soon as you mention Tiger, the sales quadruple, the TV, everything just goes crazy. But yeah, the more modern people, your Rorys, your Tigers, and obviously Cam Smith in Australia, Adam Scott, and the big thing lately has been the Live Golf. Obviously, everyone's kind of eyes when that all went down. Everyone's sort of watching Live and seeing what this big crazy thing was going to be. That's really brought a lot of young eyes, and obviously Netflix series and Netflix specials. They always bring in a lot of viewers as well. So it's been good. And so I think it's for the better. And as you said, there's a lot of opportunities both in college, high school, overseas, whether that's on the European tour, Asian tour. There's so much more opportunity these days instead of just a PGA tour. There's really opportunities everywhere, which is good.
Yeah, and I want to start off, I guess, at the ugly end. What are the common injuries with golf? Obviously, lower back, wrist, shoulders, and knees tend to be a bit of the common things. But what have you seen in your career, and what tend to be the common trend? And and then talk about like the physical demands, because obviously they're not playing just 18 holes. They're playing 18 holes, multiple times in a very short window of time as well.
Yeah, well, I guess you got to think about the different golfers and different age groups, different skill levels that you're looking at. I guess you've got a wide range because, as you mentioned, a pro golfer in particular, they're not just going to play 18 holes. There's a lot of demand in terms of their bodies, in terms of what they're doing. Most pro golfers will practice/play sort of 6-7 hours a day, which is probably a bit of a shock to a lot of people. Everyone thinks you just go out and whack a ball and Bob's your uncle. It's easy after that, but most of them are putting for hours a day, chipping on the range, playing 9 to 18 holes, and then they're doing all the other stuff, which I'm sure we'll talk about later, like being in the gym, doing their stretching routines, doing their yoga, their meditation, all these sort of things. But there's obviously a big difference in demand between a professional and a recreational golfer, really. But yeah, really just got to take into consideration all those things that they have to do throughout their day. But the common injuries, I guess, are the ones that a lot of people would have heard of. You got your golfer's elbow, your tennis elbow, so a lot of elbow and wrist injuries. The back injuries, obviously, are very important. A bigger thing. Tiger Woods obviously is a big one there. But yeah, your knees and your hips and all those sort of things. And I guess a big thing is the male versus female is a big thing as well. You obviously got very different body types, very, very different swings. The male game is very much based on power and explosiveness and really trying to hit the ball as far as you can. Whereas if you watch the women play, it's a lot more about tempo and it's a lot more, they're obviously much more flexible as a general rule. So we're generally getting more of those repetitive strain injuries in the females, especially. And in the men's, a lot more of those sort of force power injuries in your low back, your knees, these sort of ones, because of the torque that they're putting through their body. Go on.
No, you're right. Because you mentioned that, I guess, the physiological differences between men and women, obviously, and then the structural differences that they have as well. Obviously, the women being a lot more mobile in general, and obviously relying on that, almost like using themselves as a coil. But with the males, they're trying to be more like a generator. They're really trying to to get their body really behind it quite heavily. It's quite interesting to hear like the differences of that. And then unfortunately, all that torque they're generating is obviously going to, if it's going to go through a small area, all that force, especially it's on a repetitive nature as well.
Correct, yeah. And as I said, that's why the girls are so much more prone to these elbow injuries, wrist injuries, all these little sort of tendinopathy type ones and overuse injuries. Whereas the men, you see a lot more of those low back, necks, knees, and all those sort of ones. I guess another one which probably gets overlooked as well is when you think about professional sport, is probably the travel that's involved. And a lot of people don't think about that. You've got to remember some of these people are playing 30 to 35 tournaments a year over sort of maybe a 45 weeks in a year. So you're getting in a plane, out of a plane, sleeping in different beds, all these sort of things. So you do get a lot of these other injuries, like your little neck injuries, back injuries, from all these different traveling, and the pressures from travel itself as well.
Yeah, and the one thing I've noticed, especially in Melbourne, because we've got a lot of junior golfers that will travel up to like New South Wales or Queensland. We've had a few go to WA and whatnot, is the climate as well. And I've noticed that the climate actually plays a bigger factor. Obviously, I've actually recommended some of the players actually get into the sauna 2 weeks prior to actually become more acclimatized to the heat, so they actually can deal with the fluid loss when they're out on the course. And especially when there's like a 10 to 12 degree Celsius difference over a 3 or 4 day tournament, like day one, you're good. Day two, a little bit difference. Day three, it really starts to make an impact. And day four, you really start to see a massive drop. Have you ever seen that on the tour as well? Or is it because of the way that the pros travel, they're always going to relatively warm climates versus those who, they're based in one area, it's relatively cold, and then they end up traveling to somewhere warm? Do you ever see any differences when it comes to the temperature differences?
Yeah, well, generally the golf tour follows the summer, as a general. But as most people be aware, the UK is even in the summer can be pretty cold. We had one really big one where we were in the UK for the British Open, and then we flew back to America, and we're playing in what's called the Solheim Cup, which is America versus Europe. and that was going from kind of temperatures of 15 degrees Celsius to high 30s, and it was a very sort of intense tournament. This is kind of Solheim Cup is the equivalent of Ryder Cup in the men's, so it's probably the biggest tournament that the females have outside the majors, and both emotionally, physically, very demanding, and it was a big strain on their bodies on that week.
Yeah, and then how was their performance? Like, were they able to hold it off, or what happened during the tournament?
They did. There's definitely a bit of a decline towards the end, but yeah, we made a big priority from a health point of view in terms of fluid intake, diet, all those sort of things. Sort of kind of maintain body temperature, all that sort of stuff. It was like, again, I'm not huge on sort of ice baths and those sort of things, depending on why you're using them. But there were sort of important to lower the core body temperature when they were sort of coming off the course, so they can sort of maintain that sort of their body as well.
Yeah, and start the recovery process as fast as possible.
Correct.
Yeah. To bring the core temperature down. Cool. And then what's your approach to treatment? So, when you're treating golf injuries, how are you working with the golfer? How are you working with the coach? What's your approach when you're working with golfers?
Yeah, well, I guess my approach with golfers, at the start isn't too dissimilar to when I'm working with the general population. It's always going to start with an assessment, looking at sort of strength testing, range of motion, mobility, and then what differs from probably the golfers is looking a bit more specific at the demands of the sport, really. So looking at specifically the rotation, the strength in certain areas, like through the pelvis, through the glutes, their ability to rotate in certain areas and load, how they load in certain patterns. Because if they don't load in those sort of patterns, they're going to go what we tend to say is like off plane. Think about a plane of how a club or a racket or a bat or whatever it goes on. The more sort of problems we have in the body, the less likely we are to stay on plane and change the position of the club.
And how do you go working with golfers on the mental side as well? So obviously, they get injured. Obviously, they're going to be upset and down about themselves. How do you get them back, not just physically, or obviously you're doing it physically, but how do you help them mentally as well?
Yeah, look, I think it's it's a bit simple. You got to treat them like they're normal people. You got to talk to them, and you don't have to go too in depth. And the good thing about where I was working with a lot of professionals is that I'm not the only one in their team, which can be good. Sometimes I'm the only one that's with them for the week, so I can have a fair bit of burden for that week. But the good thing is they've always got, whether it's a mental coach, a psychologist, or someone on that train of thought who they can pick up the phone and talk to if they do really need to get sort of a bit of help there. And it's good that I think that my goal in that is, or my role in that is, just to make sure we use the whole team and not think that I can do everything, because everyone can't do everything, and you got to know where your role is. But look, I'm there for them and there to talk to them and help them along that journey, I think.
Cool. And then looking at the habits, how do you, obviously you'll see some recreational golfers that come through that, may want to play, club tournaments and whatnot. It's like, what are the key differences in terms of like the pros versus like the amateurs that are coming up through the ranks?
Yeah, well, I guess, again, it's understanding the process that they go about. A lot of the golfers will get there in terms of a round they play. Like their day starts, or their warm-up starts, an hour and a half before their round. And again, I think a lot of people wouldn't understand that, and they wouldn't think, they think, oh, get up on the first tee, stretch a little bit and hit a ball down the middle of the fairway. But a lot of them are there early in the morning. If it's even if it's a 7 o'clock round, a lot of them will get there at 6 o'clock even beforehand. They'll be in the locker room doing their sort of mobility and stretching routine, and then there'll be some activation work, which is using sort of various items, whether that's ball throwing, banded work. To me, there's some interesting gadgets out there on the golf world, and that will really sort of set their day up. And it's that routine that they use, followed by their putting, their chipping, their range work, where they'll go through practicing with every club in their bag, really. So it's a big difference between what you see in recreationally, where people turn up. 30 minutes would probably be a crazy warm-up for a recreational golfer, right? They would think that would be insane. So I think that's a starting point, is sort of getting that pre-round routine right, because that sort of sets the tone for the whole day.
Yeah. And then what are they, I guess, with the training side, what does their training side usually look like when they're on tour as well? So what are the kind of key things that, are they getting to the gym? Are they, do they have access to a gym? There's a lot of logistical issues that come with being on tour. So how do they actually approach that?
Yeah, most of the people that I was sort of working with, we kind of have a minimum of stuff that they're required to carry with them. So I was like, all right, well, we know we're not going to have access to gym every week. We're going to try to most weeks. Some hotels will have sort of some basic gym equipment, and some players will sort of seek out a proper gym to go to every week. But as a minimum, we tried to have, foam rollers, bands, some at least light weights, things like that. Some even carry a bit like water bags and things like that, so they could have certain weights with them. So they try and do that. It's like any sort of sport, I guess, and you're probably better at this than me, even of sort of scaling the whole season and sort of setting that whole plan up for the whole season. And you're not going to be on a high load for the whole 12 months, are you? So a lot of in tournaments, they're doing a lot more sort of mobility work, working on some speed and things like that. And in their off weeks, when they're home, they'll do a lot more strength-based work, really working to sort of get some high load into them to work on those strengths.
Yeah, then I guess during that downtime as well, or even like after the tournaments, like what are some of the key things that the professionals do in terms of like that post-tournament recovery that I guess some of the up and coming golfers would just pass on by, especially if they're in their teenage years?
Yeah, well, again, back to kind of like your strength and mobility in particular. A lot of the golfers, they'd fly home from their tournament and they'll be in the gym that day or the next day. They might not be doing those high load exercises, but they'll be doing their mobility, their breathing work, all those sort of things, which are so important for them to maintain and really work on that for the whole 12 months. Because, one, from a mental point of view, because if you do stop that, you lose your habit. And then I think that's an important thing that probably I find and you find with your clients and patients is that, habitual things are so important. When you lose that and they get out of the routine, it's very hard to get back into it. And that's why it's so important.
Yeah, and I think it's all about just maintaining the tissue adaptations that you've actually worked on as well, especially in that off season. You might only get like an 8-10 week off season as well. It's a very short window of time that the idea is you're not going to get much time to further develop as much as you would like to compared to the off season. So it's all about just maintaining those specific qualities, whether it is speed, mobility, getting on top of those soft tissue areas, as you alluded to with those injuries or any little flare-ups that may be popping up. You just get into those and address those pretty quickly.
Exactly. Yeah. So it just makes it's just so much easier if they are staying on top of that, really.
Yeah. And then I guess what are some of the key tips or things that the recreational players can actually apply that the pros are actually doing at the moment as well?
Well, in terms of sort of some strengths specific that they can work on.
Just like little things, like literally like all those like 1%ers that could actually improve their game quite far.
Yeah, well, I guess one big thing I think is understated is also the mental aspect of the game. And this happens in all sports, but golf, I feel like, is almost more than any. We break down how the golf round goes. We end up having, as a pro, for example, we have 70 to 80 swings in a round, and takes about 2 seconds to swing a golf club, and that's probably a long swing. So that's only a couple of minutes worth of swinging, and it's a 4 or 5 hour round, really. So I think it's important to understand the mental aspect and how you can go about that, and how you are within your own thoughts and what you can do for that time period between shots, during shots, all those sort of things. I feel like it is very important. Then it goes back to what we were talking about before in terms of mobility, strength, ability to move. If you can't move, it's very hard for a coach to coach a swing, isn't it? You need to have certain aspects, both strength and mobility, to get into certain positions. And look, there are some people who have very strange swings, and everyone doesn't have the exact same swing. But there are some key principles in terms of the ability to store energy and release energy through the club and onto the ball that we need to be able to do.
Yeah, and then I guess what's the key takeaways or actionable advice that you'd give to someone to actually help with the prevention of injuries, but also the longevity in the game that you've noticed over your career?
Yeah, I think it comes back again to those mobility and sort of working on those strengths and all those training aspects which we've been speaking about through this period. Is if we're not mobile, particularly through that thoracic spine and that back, what tends to happen in terms of swing faults and things we have is we tend to extend and change that plane of our spine, looking for that range. And if we don't have that range and we're trying to find that range, it puts things into positions which they're not used to, and overloads, as again, back to that back injuries, all those sort of things where we're putting way too much force on areas which aren't designed to have that much force through them. So having that mobility is kind of number one. And number two is working on that storing energy. And a lot of that will come through the pelvis and through the hips, which I'm sure you sort of work a lot with some of your athletes as well. The ability to sort of load, particularly in the thing about a right-handed golfer, the ability to hinge and load and sort of come into that right hip and then explode out of that hip and sort of produce that energy. So I think actionable sort of things that we're talking about is really working on that mobility and that ability to move, whether that's through sort of stretching, yoga type things, sort of foam rolling type sort of motions, and then working on particularly that pelvic strength and that pelvic control for the ability to store energy. And if we can sort of get those two things working together, it's a sort of a big step forward for those recreational golfers and to be able to sort of make their bodies sort of impact the ball, but also avoid injury as well.
Yeah, and I think the biggest thing working with a lot of junior golfers is actually teaching them the ability for the pelvis to move over the femoral head, or the ball of the femur. And when they're actually able to do that, so if we're looking at for someone who's a right-handed golfer, it's the pelvis's ability to actually shift back. So the right side actually shift back to be able to load into that pelvis, like you said, to be able to store that energy, and then be able to get that pelvis actually to start to rotate over the left femur, the left thigh bone, to actually allow the hips to actually turn through, which will actually turn the torso through. So it creates that kinetic energy that you mentioned as well. So I think that's probably like the key thing. Otherwise, you end up just being like a T-Rex hacking at the ball, unfortunately. So I think that's probably been the key thing, is like a lot of the movement patterns, like as you mentioned, and we've been doing this a lot more, is teaching all our athletes, all our hitting sports, especially like baseball, field hockey, tennis, even like some of our lacrosse athletes as well, is actually teaching them to actually be able to shift the weight across into the opposite side. So we adduct, but then also that allows for that internal rotation as well for the hips actually to turn through to be able to generate that power.
Yeah, well, that's how we store and sort of use power, isn't it? We think about the swing of going into that right side and using that, as I said, it's that adduction, internal rotation, and then opening up the posterior hip to lengthen through the glutes. So then we can transfer left and transfer the energy across over the top of that left leg, of the left femur, I guess. And if you need to be able to get that pattern, as I said, we go back to the common injuries and common faults that people have. If you can't do that, it's going to put much more pressure on other places, or you're going to come way off plane on the swing, which I kind of mentioned before. So it's one of those two faults. Either you're going to have to extend your back, okay, and put more pressure on your back, or you're going to have to sort of extend your knee more, all those sort of things, which goes back to those common injuries. Or if we don't have the range, we'll then hinge our wrists more, bend the elbows more, all those sort of things, which then all goes back to what we spoke about earlier about those common injuries. But yeah, so the linchpin is having that mobility and being able to load that pelvis and load those hips to get that force.
I guess Happy Gilmore was, coach. It's all in the hips.
It's all in the hips. That's very much true.
And then how can people find you if they want to get in contact with you? They want to get some treatment from you. Obviously, being an expert osteo, working in the golf world. How can people get in contact with you?
Yeah, so you can find me sort of at the practice at Dingley Health Hub. And if anyone wants to sort of go on there, our website is www.dingleyhealthhub.com.au. So pretty simple one. And I'm pretty easily accessible via email, just shane@dingleyhealthhub.com.au. Not too crazy on the socials as much as you guys, but the clinic socials are firing. But personally, if you follow us on the clinic socials and reach out there, I'm more than happy to have a chat. So any golf related questions, or even osteo related questions or health, I'm pretty open and pretty happy to share knowledge. So if anyone wants to touch base, feel free to reach out.
Yeah, and I guess the last question is on leaving on this note. Where do you see, I guess, is there going to be any innovations when it comes to the treatment side, when it comes to working with golfers, or in terms of, I guess, from an S&C perspective? Do you see anything kind of creeping up, behind the scenes that might make the next step forward in terms of improving performance and optimizing the health of golfers?
I think when you're looking at sort of the pro world, and you can see a big shift over the sort of past few years about, again, producing speed. Speed is such a big thing, and the ability to get speed on the club head and on the ball. And that you can see through the college level and even to the younger pros, that there's such a big emphasis on that. As opposed to the older pros, who was much more about sort of tempo and, again, thinking about slow swings, all that sort of stuff. But the ability to hit the ball an extra 30 meters or 30, 40 yards is a massive thing and a massive advantage. And if you can get more speed on the ball, I think that's where it's going.
Cool. Sweet. Thanks for your time, Shane. Really appreciate it. If you want to get a hold of Shane, we'll put his contact details in the show notes. Other than that, Shane, thanks for being a part of it, and we'll see you on the next one.
Thanks for having me.
You have just listened to the Inner Athlete podcast. Be sure to subscribe to stay up to date with the release of weekly episodes. Be sure to follow us on Facebook and Instagram to get great tips on all things youth athlete development and youth mentoring.